Good to have you back, George. It's been some time.
It has been some time.
Do you remember the last time?
I think it was just before the referendum.
It was a week before the referendum, which we might touch on a little bit later.
Really?
Well, let's start off talking about your new role. I say new role. It's almost exactly a year since since it was announced that you were going to take over the editorship. There was a lot of controversy at the time. People saying, "Well, how can a serving MP be editor of the Evening Standard?" Now, you then decided to stand down at the election. Has it been a bit of a roller coaster, a real sort of learning experience for you?
Well, it's certainly been a learning experience, but one I have massively enjoyed. I think even more so than I thought I might. I mean, of course, at the time, I offended two, great professions. All the journalists thought, "What's this guy doing, turning up at the newsroom?" And all the politicians said, "Well, what's this former chancellor doing, going to edit a newspaper?" And I thought the best thing to do was just to get on with the job and see how I did it and how people reacted to it. I also think, former politicians or former ministers, people who've done jobs like mine, they're in a sort of trap, which is you can spend the rest of your life just talking about what you did. In my case, between the ages of 38 and 45, or you can try something new and not do something that's just living off your past successes and failures, but try a new profession. And at the age now of 46, I feel I've sort of embarked on the second stage of my adult life.
There's no book, How to Be a Newspaper Editor. I mean, most people would get that job after they've been in newspapers for many, many years. You went straight into it, and you must have felt you had something to prove to all the journalists on the Standard.
Well, on day one, I sat on the back bench, which, for those who know the jargon, I had to learn all the jargon, in journalism is where all the action is. It's where the paper is put together and all the great reports from our reporters and photographs and whatever come in. And really within an hour or two of sitting there, you realise you've got to throw yourself into the paper every day. And, you as the editor, of course, are responsible for what's on the front page, the editorial line, the look of the newspaper, making sure there's light as well as shade. And, of course, I didn't know that on day one. I hope I've learnt a lot more over the last year. But I think there is a kind of one similarity between politics and journalism. And it's not just that, of course, we report on politics. It's, if you're in a government, you might have lots of different things going on in lots of different departments, but you're trying to provide a coherent overall story of the government and its approach, or the political party and its approach. And in a newspaper too, although you'll have sports stories and culture stories and business stories and political stories and so on, the whole thing has got to cohere. And so there's a similar, I think that's the job of a newspaper editor, to try and bring all those disparate bits together. But, I wouldn't be able to do any of that if I hadn't inherited a very good team at the Standard, which I have.
How much do you actually get involved in it, though, yourself? Because I'm told that you actually write quite a few of the editorials yourself. That's not necessarily the case with a lot of newspaper editors. Clearly, you look at the news coverage as well, and I can kind of detect your hand in some of that too.
Well, I think all newspapers, certainly in Britain, have editorial attitude, if you like. And I actually think that's quite important, particularly in an age where it's very likely by the time you pick up your copy of the Standard in the evening, you will have seen the news of the day on your mobile phone. And the Standard isn't what it was when I was a child, the way London learns what's going on. So the Standard, and I'm sure this is true of other newspapers, but let me just speak about the Standard. I think it has to entertain and inform and be challenging and, as I say, have some attitude. And in the redesign we've done this week, I wanted the paper to sort of turn up the volume, not just in its sort of politics, but in its business coverage, its arts coverage, its sport, which are such important elements of the newspaper, and which people, when they're looking at how I edit the paper, don't really think about, because they think of me as a former politician and they look at the political coverage. But actually I take enormous interest in and take enormous pleasure out of working with the sport and culture and business teams on the paper.
In terms of what next, though, I've noticed you've taken London off the masthead. It's now just Evening Standard. Does that mean that you're looking to expand it outside London, like the Metro newspaper has done? Well,
we've got no plans to do that, and we have a big distribution in London. The Evening Standard has got more readers than at any point in its 190-year history. and close to 2 million people read it every day, and close to 1 million copies will be being picked up as I speak now. So it's got a big paper circulation, but of course there are really two things to observe here. One is it's got a website now, and a lot of the investment at the company is going into the website, and that's not limited to London or the Southeast. People in the United States, just like they listen to this show in the United States, Australia, and of course this used to be only a London radio station. The Evening Standard too has an international audience, and I also think in this day and age, and in the perhaps more sort of troubling global times we're in, it's important for the paper not just to speak to London and cover what's going on, for example, in City Hall, but also to speak for a set of values it has. It had before I arrived, values I certainly had as well as a politician, which is, to be internationalist, socially liberal, pro-business. And that voice, I would argue, is somewhat lacking, both in our media and in our political world at the moment. And there's therefore a gap in the market, if you like, for the Evening Standard to sit itself.
Now, given this week's events, it's interesting that your proprietor is Russian. Is there any pressure from the proprietor on the line that you take on what's happening at the moment?
None whatsoever. I can absolutely assure you of that. And indeed, if you look at our coverage and our editorials and indeed our cartoons this week, they've been pretty critical, as you would expect and you would hope, of Russia and Vladimir Putin. Indeed, the owner of the Evening Standard, a Russian, owns the opposition paper in Russia, so has quite a long history, as it happens, of critiquing the Vladimir Putin regime. And look, also, as a paper that represents a city which is the home of the Russian embassy and presumably the centre of the Russian espionage operation, we are acutely critical of that, and indeed today acutely critical of some politicians, notably the Labour leader, who are not, in our view, being strong enough in their response.
Do you think that Theresa May went far enough yesterday in the measures she announced to effectively punish Russia?
The short answer is yes, and of course, I also remember my former job I had and sitting in the Britain's National Security Council. She has to set out measures that send a very, very clear message to Russia that their involvement in this poisoning, either ordering the attempted assassination or allowing the chemical weapons they have to fall into rogue hands, is totally unacceptable. But I think what people probably haven't appreciated is she has to think through, well, Russia's going to retaliate in some way, and indeed the Russian foreign minister has said that today. What's my next stage? What do I do in response to that Russian retaliation? So I suspect, and I don't have, of course, the inside track anymore, that Theresa May and the British government has a further set of measures it could announce and needs to have, in government, you've always got to think, what's the next stage ahead? What happens if X happens, we do Y, and then Z happens. So I would suspect they've got more shots in their locker.
Do you regret calling Theresa May a dead woman walking and saying you wouldn't rest until she was chopped up in little pieces at the bottom of your freezer?
Well, look, as I said actually through an editorial in the Evening Standard, I think a lot of harsh things were said, including by me, and I would draw a distinction between remarks made in private, which I shouldn't have made, and have said so, and political observations about the state of the Conservative government and the outcome of the general election and the reality of the position of the Conservative leadership, which, as I'm sure you discuss every day, is not as strong as perhaps it once was.
Or indeed stable, to coin a phrase.
Indeed.
Have you made up with Theresa May? When was the last time you talked to her?
About 2 weeks ago, as it happens.
Can I ask what about?
Well, it was a private conversation, but first of all, I think it's perfectly reasonable for the Prime Minister to have a relationship with the editor of the London Evening Standard, and of course it's perfectly reasonable for two Conservative colleagues who worked together for many years to have a relationship. That doesn't mean I agree with everything she's doing. It doesn't mean she agrees with all my editorials, but you want to have, of course, a functioning relationship.
Looking back to the aftermath of the Litvinenko murder, which of course happened, was it 2006? But the inquiry happened under your government with David Cameron. A lot of people thought that maybe the sanctions that were imposed after that were a little bit weak, and therefore Putin has almost taken strength from that and thought, well, I can basically do what I like because Britain isn't going to respond. Do you think we were too weak in our response at that time?
Well, I mean, I will stand corrected if I've got this wrong, but I think actually the Litvinenko measures were in place under the Gordon Brown government, but we certainly continued them. And of course, then Russia invaded Crimea and through its irregular forces invaded the Ukraine, and we stepped up those sanctions. I think you have to ask yourself this, what is the limit of what you're prepared to? Are we going to go to war with Russia? No, we're not. Should we have very strong deterrence in place? Yes, we should. And there are now British soldiers in Eastern Europe, and we have vastly improved our cyber capability, both offensive as well as defensive. Should we sanction individuals? Yes, we should, and we did. Do we think those individuals are going to keep all their money in Britain? No, of course not, because they're not idiots and they can see the way that the wind has blown in recent years. Should we always be looking to at least provide some sort of route for a future improvement in relations? Yes, we should, although, of course, now they're going to go, I suspect, into the deep freeze, and rightly so. We tried, actually, in 2010, as I think any new government would in Britain, to try and find a route for a better relationship with Vladimir Putin. David Cameron put a lot of personal effort into that, and ultimately it didn't come to fruition. But I think, you always have to be looking, whilst maintaining a very strong position of strength, for some way to reduce tension in the world.
Do you think we're heading for a new version of the Cold War?
Well, you and I grew up during the Cold War, and I think that's a very different situation from what we have now in this sense, which is we were constantly told we were minutes away from potential nuclear destruction, and we had around the world forces on high alert. It's different from that, but I think relations between Russia and Britain have rarely been as poor as they are today. That is entirely brought upon us by the activities of the Russian government. And of course, even in the Cold War, there were one or two notable exceptions, but attempted assassinations using chemical weapons on British soil, was not something that was even a regular feature of the Cold War. So you have to ask yourself what the motive here is, beyond sort of sending a message that anyone who betrays Russia will be dealt with. But that feels to me pretty childish.
Let me just remind everyone, you can watch us on Facebook Live on the LBC Facebook page, or indeed on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk. Should the Conservative Party stop accepting any money associated with Russia? £820,000 worth of donations in recent years. Should that stop now?
Well, you always have to make a judgment when you accept a donation, assuming the donation is legal and transparent, and you should never accept something that's not legal or not transparent. What is the reputation of the person I'm accepting this money from? So it's a choice the political party has about whether to accept the money or not. It's not obliged to accept money. And I think, I think party funding is actually, I know this, is a view not that all of your listeners will agree with, is vastly cleaner than it was actually when I started off in politics, when there were extremely large political parties like the Conservative Party. Of course, Labour's got its own issues with the unions and momentum and so on, but a party like the Conservative Party was almost entirely dependent on 4 or 5 individuals when I started off as an MP and when I first became the Shadow Chancellor, who would write multi-million-pound cheques, many of them for very good reason, honest reasons and out of generosity and care for their country. But nevertheless, we were totally dependent on these individuals. And the funding model that has been created in the last 10 years is that we need money to fight our campaigns and play a part in our democracy, but we largely get that money now from a much broader range of people. So we are not dependent, as the implication of your question, on one Russian oligarch.
Dependent. I say you're not obviously there doing this anymore, but the Conservative Party may not be dependent. But when you have Marina Litvinenko saying that it's effectively tainted money, that ought to give the new Conservative Party chairman Brandon Lewis food for thought, shouldn't it?
Well, I'm sure the Conservative Party is looking at some donations, but I wouldn't want to kind of blanket. I think there's a risk that you equate the Russian government, whose behaviour is totally unacceptable, with all Russians. And there are many, I say this as the editor of the Standard, I know there are many thousands of Russians living in London who make a great contribution to our society, and by the way are as appalled, if not more so, at what Vladimir Putin's up to than anyone else. So, I just think sometimes these generalizations need to be watched. But do I suspect at Tory HQ they are going through some of these donations and saying, well, maybe we won't take money in the future from some of these people? I suspect, yes.
How do you think Sadiq Khan is doing as Mayor of London? You've been relatively pro him in your newspaper.
Well, I think it's quite important for the London newspaper not to set itself against the Mayor of London without good reason. And particularly when he's relatively new to the job still. There will be an election in 2020, and then we will hold him to account, and we will examine the alternative candidate, and we will make a recommendation. And we could certainly back Sadiq Khan, or we could certainly back the alternative candidate that the Conservative Party or whoever else puts forward. My view is, he has had a solid start. He is respected around the world, which is important for the Mayor of London. He is pro-business, which is a good thing. But I think on key pledges like housing and crime, which were central to his manifesto, he has not done nearly enough. And that is a point that the Standard makes.
How often do you speak to him?
Fairly regularly. Quite often we are at the same events, actually, in London, both speaking or both presenting.
Does he ring you up sort of fairly regularly? Well, I don't like what you've said about me there, or why don't you do something on this?
The short answer is no. So because we sort of bump into each other quite a lot, we don't tend to speak to each other on the phone. But of course, there's a regular dialogue with his office. There's the paper is regularly in touch with the mayor's office and the mayor's political assistants and so on. But we've been a good example of where we were critical recently is, he didn't really step into the momentum takeover of Haringey Council and the dismissal of a very good Labour council leader in Haringey, and he didn't step in to protect a housing scheme that would have, with private money, actually delivered really huge local residents, and instead actually chose to appear on a platform with Jeremy Corbyn backing his approach to housing in London, and we were critical of that. On the other hand, when he goes abroad and promotes London or argues for a more pro-business approach to things like Brexit, we will back him.
Big thing, I think, for Londoners at the moment, a lot of people are concerned about the possible imminent release of John Warboys, the black cab rapist. Now, there's a judicial review going on at the moment. Do you think the government maybe missed a trick there? David Gauke, the new Justice Secretary, who you know well, he worked with you at the Treasury. I thought at the time he should have led this judicial review rather than leave it to two of the victims.
I didn't see the legal advice that David got as Lord Chancellor.
But sometimes in politics you have to ignore the advice you get, don't you?
Well, that is true. And there have been more than a few occasions where I did that, and I think to the better. But I think, I think in that case, I happen to know one of the victims, and I think she has been unbelievably brave in fighting on behalf of, well, not just Warboys' victims, but actually all Londoners who might feel threatened were he to be released into London. We're still seeing where he's going to be released, but the real victory that she and others achieved yesterday was that he is not going to be allowed back into London, and it's en France, and that is a real, in my view, that's a real success for justice and the justice system listening to victims for once, which they're not always very good at doing.
Now, I can't let you go without talking a little bit about Brexit, as you might imagine. You obviously campaign vigorously to Remain, but some people accuse you of editing a Remain propaganda sheet. Do you actually accept we're going to leave the EU?
Yes, I do. I mean, I can't pretend that I think it's anything other than a very bad decision for the United Kingdom, but it was taken in a free and fair referendum. So I've always said that Britain will leave the EU. How we leave the EU is a different matter. And my view right from the day after the referendum is a result where 17 million people voted one way, 16 million people voted another, meant that we should take as a sort of pro-European approach to leaving the EU as possible. In other words, not exit from all the arrangements we have that are not identical to EU membership, like the customs union, like the single market and the like. And I think a lot of the economic problems we face at the moment and a lot of the logistical problems on the Irish border and all that kind of thing would not have occurred if we'd taken a more balanced approach to leaving the EU, which I think would have more fairly reflected the outcome, and I think also would have done much more to bring our society together. When, as you know, when I listen to your show, it's very clear from your listeners, the country is not united on Brexit.
Well, that is true. Now, we talked about the time you came in the week before the referendum. I just want to play you a very short clip from that interview where I asked you how many civil servants you had planning for Brexit, and this is what you said.
Well, the thing we're planning for is the contingency plans for dealing with the financial stability consequences in the immediate aftermath of a vote to leave. We have not got plans for, what you then do for Britain. Well, no, because it's
I'm
not...
astonished.
I don't think why you should be astonished.
Well, I'm astonished because the polls are neck and neck, and surely a responsible government would be planning for what would happen.
Do you regret the fact that you didn't have anyone planning for Brexit at the time?
I think it would have been extraordinary for a government that wanted to stay in the EU to plan for its departure. And indeed, any plan we came up with, which probably would have concluded staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, would have been bitterly contested by those who had just won the referendum. And, to leave... Once you
regret Real?
Well, I regret Britain's decision to leave the EU. But we have to, abide by the decision of the public. But how we leave is up for grabs, rightly so, in our country. And the hard Brexiteers, all their promises of money back for the NHS, easy to do trade deals with Trump's America, we'll be able to get a great deal from the EU because they need us more than we need them. But all of those things have fallen apart. And people are beginning to realise we are going to remain a highly integrated European economy 20 miles off the coast of France. And whilst I'm all for doing more business with China, and probably made that case more than anyone else in Britain, the idea that trade with China is going to replace trade with Germany and France is frankly nonsense.
But the fact that Theresa May's life has been made a lot harder because there was no preparation, you must have realised that there was a big possibility that the Leave side should win. I don't think anybody would have criticised you for having a team within the Treasury, within government, planning for what was to come if that vote did go that way.
As I explained in that interview, we had in place contingency plans for a no vote, a leave vote. They came into force immediately on that Friday morning, and that is why, in my view, Britain did not suffer a sort of financial crisis in the days immediately after the vote, because the Bank of England, the Treasury, myself, Mark Carney, had worked on those plans. But it was never going to be for us in advance of the referendum to determine, should we stay in the customs union? How should we manage the Irish border? What should our membership of the single market look like? And if we had put those plans in place, of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson would have come on this programme and said, well, we're tearing up those plans because we're out of all these things. So I don't think those plans would have anyway, even if we had drawn them up, survived a minute after the referendum, because we would have had a very different view about how to conduct our Brexit plan and our strategy than the current government has.
Sir Simon Fraser, former head of the FCO, told me a couple of weeks ago that Cameron and you threw the country into turmoil and then left. Now, he chose to leave. You didn't quite choose to leave, did you? But do you take any responsibility for that?
Well, I certainly take responsibility as part of a government that had a referendum. Although
you didn't want it, did you?
Well, I had reservations about it, but I was remain a team player and abided by the decision of the cabinet. But look, obviously it was Theresa May's decision not to keep me in the government, and David Cameron's judgment, in my view, correct one, that he couldn't continue as Prime Minister, having made this sort of central recommendation about the country's economic and security future, and remaining in office would have been impossible in that circumstance. And I think it's also, it has given the country a chance to have a new leader and a newly composed government, and they are now wrestling with those issues.
Can you envisage a return to politics in the future? Is it something that is maybe not at the front of your mind, but at the back of your mind? Because the political virus never really goes away, does it?
Well, as you know as well, because you were involved in politics, I think, you're right, it doesn't go away, in that I'm very interested in politics, I'm a Conservative, but I am not rushing to return to frontline politics. And although I don't rule it out, because I think it's stupid to rule things out, it's not where I'm thinking at all. I'm 46. I was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 6 years. I worked in a government with a team I liked, with a Prime Minister I respected and trusted. We had a parliamentary majority, so we could do some big, bold things for the country. And am I rushing to return to the House of Commons and work on how to effect Brexit? I'm afraid not.
What about City Hall? One or two people are speculating you might stand for Mayor of London next time.
Well, I think I can rule that out. I'm not going to stand for to be the Mayor of London in 2020. But that's because I'm really enjoying editing the Evening Standard. And I think the conflict of someone editing the Evening Standard who wanted to run for the Mayor of London would be totally...
Great publicity there every day.
Well, I think people might spot that after about 2 days. So I don't think it's possible to do that, and so I wouldn't do that, although it's a great job.
Just finally, is there a part of you that sometimes, when you see Theresa May attending these summits and having to make these big decisions, is there a part of you that does regret leaving the House of Commons? Because somebody said to me the other day, well, of course, if George had stayed, he would be seen as the natural successor now.
I'm very happy with the decision I made. And as I say, I had a very good time in politics. I was very lucky. Worked with a team that, had come into government, got the Conservatives back into office. We were able to do things. And, I don't want to be applying all of my brain and, however you judge that brain on how to minimise the damage of Brexit. I want to be getting on with my new life as the editor of the Evening Standard, which I'm hugely enjoying with the great team I have there.
George Osborne, thank you very much for joining us here on LBC. Hopefully we'll have you back very soon. This is LBC. It's 5:02.
On FM, online, on your mobile and on digital radio. Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.